Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Conscious 2. My guest in the studio today is Michael Stone. Hi, Michael.
Hi.
And Michael is a teacher, a thinker, and an activist. And in today's interview, we're going to be exploring what it means to be awake, but really in the kind of deeper, perhaps more embodied sense of what that means. But Michael, maybe before we come into that, just be curious a little bit about your own background, how you came to your path, how that started for you.
Well, when I was young, my best friend was my uncle, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he lived in a hospital. And many times during the week, I would take the bus and go visit him. And we would listen to the Beatles' White Album, and we would meditate together.
Oh, wow.
And because the Beatles had just gone to India, he was really interested in meditation practice and the Maharishi and the Bhagavad Gita and some of the Buddha's teaching. So when I was young, I was really exposed to these ideas in the context of a mental hospital.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's really interesting that you're kind of visiting someone in a mental hospital, but you're kind of having a spiritual inquiry as part of that. It's
yeah,
really,
I mean,
really
my
beautiful.
uncle was my best friend, and I felt when I was with him in the hospital that it was the most normal place.
Wow.
So as idealistic as it sounds, it had a deep meaning for me, and at the same time, it also made me feel quite isolated. I didn't know how to connect this ability to look at my mind with what I was supposed to do at school and why people had jobs and so on. So, you know, right at the beginning, I think, for me, there was this integration of thinking about psychology, spirituality, music, the meaning of life. And many years later, when I was around 18 years old, just after he died, I started investigating yoga practices, meditation practice, especially in the Buddhist tradition. And after a few years, I also saw that there was something about psychology that was really important in the mix. And I ended up going to university and studying psychoanalysis. So for me, these streams of, you know, the yoga tradition, the Buddhist tradition, and psychology all have been integrated right from the beginning. But also, although as a young man, my interest was getting enlightened. You know, I thought, you go on a retreat, you sit really still, you meditate, you get quiet enough, and then you're enlightened.
Something happens.
Yeah, something happens. And while I still, you know, very much continue to work with those techniques, I also have, you know, been critical of the way that can lead just internally and not have much connection with our relational lives as parents. I have 2 children, or as engaged citizens at a time when, you know, our culture really needs our participation.
Well, as we were talking off camera and we were discussing kind of how to come at the subject, and you were saying, you know, it's really an inquiry of what is consciousness. And when we talk about what does it mean to wake up or be conscious, what does that mean? I'm curious as to what that means to you at this point in your life, having especially kind of dived into these different kind of fields and your own kind of experience.
Well, I really like the term that you just used of waking up. And my interest is how to take meditative practices, contemplative practices, and the teachings that come with those practices, and translate them in a way that allows us to exit this binary way of thinking that I have to do inner work in order to then go do outer work. To me, awakening happens both internally and also relationally. Our kids wake us up, our families wake us up.
Not just in the mornings, but...
Yeah, literally, exactly. And so what I'm interested in is how awakening can be both personal and social, and how the next awakening may not be a young man sitting under a tree like the image we have of the Buddha, but the next awakenings can happen socially and also that our families can be a site of awakening, so that consciousness or enlightenment is not a private experience,
Yes.
but it's something that happens through all the areas of our life if we're willing to bring all the areas of our life into our awareness.
But of course, what often happens is people see their spiritual practice or their inner practice, something happens over here, and then they do their work or their family. And why do you think people create that split?
Well, I think because much of your audience are already interested in the language of practice, I'll sort of jump in terms of
please
technique.
do, yeah.
And I think part of it is that when we talk about meditation, we often talk about, or contemplation, we often use this language of observation or witnessing. And I think there's something that's important about that, where you want to have enough distance from certain emotions, for example, or anxiety, to really see what they are. I use the example of, imagining that you're sitting 20 rows back in a theater watching a film and not identifying with it. But I feel like a lot of spiritual teachings, they stop there, and they say that witnessing is really who you are at the core. And it's occurred to me that that experience of observing life is actually why most of us are not engaged in social issues or not more engaged in the fact that our parents really need us or our kids really need us. And so my interest is, once we have some distance from our experience, to then take, the step forward to become more intimate with our experience. So for me, awakening and intimacy are synonymous.
Yes.
Where we need to wake up to what's actually happening in our embodied moment-to-moment experience, be more intimate with what's happening, while simultaneously not holding on to it.
Yes.
So my understanding of awakening is active and is very much about waking up to the relational nature of our lives and not privileging awareness as an internal static thing that is the core of who we are.
Yes.
I want to go past that, beyond the idea of that being what's non-dual, to maybe we can invent, neo-duality or post-non-duality.
I like that.
And to really see that relationship and intimacy is the key to awakening. And it's the key to awakening because it constantly interrupts our rigid viewpoints. And lastly, that what we wake up to is not just our own inner experience. We wake up to the joy and the pain of the world. And the freer one feels, the more sensitive we become to the pain of other people.
Which can be difficult.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think one of the things that I think can often happen is that we go from being kind of in the world and suffering and kind of unconscious and whatever, we get some distance, like you say, being like kind of 20 rows back in the theatre, and there's some space that opens up and it's kind of a relief in a sense. And I wonder if that's a place that it can be a trap of just wanting to hang out in that space.
Yeah.
But I guess a step, do you see it as a necessary step, or?
I see it as part of a process, and it depends on the individual.
Okay.
But one of the things that's always puzzling to me is that a lot of the people who privilege this kind of static awareness as, the core of who you really are, I feel tend to not have families.
Right.
They tend to not be socially engaged in the culture.
Yeah.
And sometimes, to me, they seem a little bit like cardboard.
Right.
And their definition of enlightenment is always the same. They all have the same kind of awakening experience. So
and there's something fundamentally for me quite selfish about those experiences.
It can be. I don't want to judge it as being selfish, because there is something very healing in that inwardness.
Yes.
But at the same time, I feel like the goal of practice is eccentricity, which is when one is deeply in their life, they don't see it. When you're fully in your life, you don't see it. You're not outside of it. So you can be free to be who you really are. not who you think you are, and I don't mean eccentricity in the British sense
No.
of, the wild person.
I understand.
But rather that you're free in each moment to respond in a creative way.
Yes.
So that your true nature is actually your imaginative capacity to respond creatively to your own experience and to what's arising. And there's a wonderful story of a monk named Yunmen who was asked, what is the core of the teaching? And he says, an appropriate response. And I love this idea of practice becoming an appropriate response to the conditions of our life.
Yes. I want to come back to that in a moment. That's really beautiful. I'm curious before that though, what helps this transition from, if we have got caught in that place of that kind of, you call it a non-dual trap almost, of kind of being spacious and with oneness, but not really coming back into the world. What do you see supports that reintegration or that kind of coming back into the world? Is it just an awareness of that someone's in a trap, or any practices that you see support that?
I can tell you a personal story, which is I was on a meditation retreat, and I really didn't like a lot of the details of the retreat. Some of the parts of the schedule, the food, and so on, and I was really angry. And I came into the teacher, it was a Zen teacher, and I came in to meet him in the evening, and I said, I'm really feeling angry. And he said, show me. And I said, well, I'm angry, and I described how it's happening in my body, and he says, you're talking about the anger, but show me the anger. And I couldn't do it. And I went back the next day and said, I'm angry, and he said, show me the anger. Telling me about your anger is not angry.
It's not embodied.
And that went against everything I had ever learned in meditation, that don't misidentify with the anger and so on. Finally, after 4 or 5 days, 4 or 5 meetings, I came to see him and I just exploded. And then he said, that's it. And then the anger stopped.
Yeah.
And he said, that's one with the anger, is to become so angry that you don't act it out.
Right.
And that there's no self in it.
Yes.
And when we become really intimate with our experience, it's not happening to anybody. It's just the experience arising. There's no self that it refers to.
Yes.
And so for me, that really taught me something. First of all, I was so alive.
Yeah.
I was in relationship, and I wasn't outside of the experience as a kind of observer, And that was very challenging because it went against everything I had ever learned in meditation.
Those ideas that you shouldn't be angry, or you shouldn't have that experience.
Yeah, and in that moment, I was just completely myself, and then the anger wasn't a problem, and there was no subject that was having the experience.
Yes.
And then there was a real freedom after, because the anger didn't come back. And it taught me that it takes some courage to really be so intimate with something that you don't experience it as personal. And for me, that's sort of the realm of technique in some way.
Yes.
But it's also, I think, a kind of guiding principle of practice, which is to not be afraid of engaging any mental state, while at the same time, as we engage it, we don't hold on to it.
Yes.
And that's really easy to talk about.
Sure, no.
You're a parent, so you know also.
I fully understand what you're saying. And I want to go back to what you were saying about appropriate response. And I think that's particularly in the context of social activism. And we were talking again a little bit off camera, and I was saying that it really surprises me that the number of conscious people that are somewhat unconscious about certain events in the world, or at least disengaged from that. And I'm curious as to, when you look at issues like social inequality or climate change, some of the kind of the big issues of our time, what is the appropriate response? Or how do those issues impact you in your life, and I guess also in your teaching?
Well, maybe to begin with, let's just name some of the big issues, because I've narrowed it down in my own life to 3.
Okay.
The first is climate change.
Yes.
I think climate change is really an issue of overconsumption, and it's also an issue that affects non-industrialized countries more than the industrialized countries. And So to me, that's one piece. When you look deeply in climate change, you see every other issue. And the second issue is economic inequality.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the separation now between, what's often called the 1% and the 99% is really, killing democracy in many countries.
Yeah.
The third issue that I think is connected to the first two, that gets much less media attention, is the atrophy of intimacy in our own bodies, in our relationships, and the degradation of intimacy in our communities is really the loss of democracy. So I feel like these three issues are the issues of our era.
Yes.
And I think that if spiritual practices can't address these issues head on, then these exotic practices of meditation or breath work will be, fetishized or become a fashion that disappears after a few decades.
Yeah.
Because we have to look really clearly at these issues. And I do think that spiritual practice really has something to offer, but if we don't, look at what it has to offer, then I feel like it can contribute to apathy.
Yes.
And that's why I try not to stop at just observing.
Right.
We have to engage.
Right.
Yeah.
And then coming back to appropriate response. I mean, let's take social.
What's the appropriate response?
Especially let's take you can choose whichever one you want to.
Yeah.
Maybe, but social inequality is a good example. And the whole kind of protest movement that's kind of had a lot of momentum, and it seems to have lost some of its momentum around that. But what is appropriate, because when you really, and climate change is another example, you step back and you really look at it and you just go, this isn't okay. It's just like, it's not okay.
It's not okay, yeah.
But what
well, I think there's three basic things that we can do.
Okay.
The first is we all need to be able to stop. The stopping has to happen internally, which is we need to be able to work with the momentum of our habits that, we're often scared of really meeting head on. The stopping also has to happen externally, which is we need to not cooperate with systems of violence that we're reinforcing just by participating in them. The second thing we can do is we need to practice. To say, let's just stop, is a wonderful philosophical perspective.
Yeah.
But I think you need a practice to really be able to stop. And I'd love to talk more about that for hours, which we don't have.
Sure.
But the third principle or the third practice is we need to be able to tell new stories. And I think the most radical thing anybody can do in their culture is to tell the stories that are not being told. And when you stop and you have a practice, a space clears. And in that space, you're able to respond appropriately or more creatively, which means you can be in any situation and not go to the default narrative.
Yes.
And whether it's your depression or your anger or your hurt, or your ideas about the economy, you can notice your addiction to a certain narrative, not identify with it. And when that happens, it's not just like there's a spaciousness, and again, I'm critiquing a little the way meditation sometimes taught is you end up in a space, but within that space, we recognize that there's a different way to tell the story of our life.
Yes.
And so that's why I was saying, our deeper nature is this capacity for imagination. And what I'm interested in is how to scale that up socially.
Right.
So that we can recognize as a society we're addicted to certain narratives about success or about electricity or about the two-column accounting system and recognize this isn't sustainable. And so to me, the sign that there's addiction is that there's no imagination. So in a way, telling a new story starts to undo the patterns of addiction that I think we're all caught in,
Yes.
individually and socially.
But of course, it takes a lot of courage for someone to drop their story. And I think especially going back to the kind of social kind of issues, I think people have a lot of identity in the story they have around it. You know, and of course there's probably truth in the story, but there's also the place where there's a position in the story, which often isn't helpful. But it's like, how do we stay engaged with, to take it put another way, you mentioned the first piece around not participating, but my sense is often what gives us the courage to not participate is the story that we hold about it. And so it's a real challenge to be able to engage without being rigid. And I don't know if you have any thoughts you've got around that.
Well, it's threatening sometimes.
Right.
You know, I was very involved in the Occupy movement and in New York. And when the Occupy movement got going, a reporter took a photo of me. I ended up in the newspaper. My father, who's the most apolitical person I know, read the paper and he said, everything that you're saying is true. Inequality is true. The bank's losses were socialized and their profits were privatized.
I totally understand, yeah.
And then he said, but if I really take what you're saying deeply, it scares the hell out of me because it changes everything that I believe in.
It pulls the rug on the whole system.
Exactly.
In a sense, yeah.
So what I'm interested in is seeing how, it pulls the rug out. And so we need to allow the rug to be pulled out because our economic issues, our social issues, our spiritual issues are all interconnected. And the good news is that if they're interconnected, the solutions are also interconnected. That's
really interesting. What was just popping through my mind as you were talking was it's like when we do inner work and we get that moment where we discover we're just completely not who we think we are.
Yes.
It's like we really see through the veils of that.
Yeah.
I guess it's a similar thing on a social level. It's like when you really expose it, it's like it's not how I thought it was.
Yeah.
But then it's what supports us in that place of uncertainty to have the courage to stay with that, letting something new unfold.
Let's back up to the more personal again, which is that when you can stop and feel your breathing, for example, and notice your capacity for greed, or notice your capacity for envy, or jealousy, or just wanting anything. When you can work with that, when you don't act it out, just to be able to recognize your potential for anger or greed or what have you, and not act it out, that is a form of social action.
Yes.
Because you're not acting out those seeds in the culture.
You're not feeding it, yeah.
Yeah, and then you plant in your, what seems on the outside like not doing anything, you're actually planting seeds of kindness, seeds of equanimity, and so on. So you know, I don't want to, say that, everything we're doing is out there in an extroverted sense, but taking care of what's going on in our own minds and hearts is a form of social activism.
Yes.
So we don't need a revolution. I think what we need is an active rebellion. Because
I like that.
Revolution replaces one power structure with another power structure.
Yes.
And when you look at what's happening in Egypt or what happened in Cuba, it's not that inspiring.
I get it.
The revolution is inspiring because we're lit up.
But what comes next is problematic, yeah.
So that's why I think in the next era, it's not so much a revolution we need with a whole new ideology, but we need a personal practice that's linked up with others so that it's a networked awakening. So that the awakening is social, other people are supporting our awakening, and we're including the personal transformation that needs to happen so that as we build new societies, we're not building them based on a new ideology, We're building them based on this networked practice,
Yes.
which includes both the telling of new stories, but it also includes taking care of our own internal desires for power and control and so
Yes.
on. And I think unless that's included, any revolution is going to be incredibly inspiring while it's happening,
Yes.
and then the tendency to fall back into greed and traditional power structures is just so strong.
Yeah. We've got a couple of minutes left, but just something on that's also really, I find it fascinating, is that we mentioned, for example, the banking situation, and of course there was an unbelievable amount of greed and deceit in some ways in terms of how that was all possible and the way it was kind of dealt with. And you were saying earlier that those same qualities, of course, exist in all of us. And it's very easy for us to demonize the particular people that have the power to do that.
Right.
But you could argue that many people in society, given that power, because people are creative on their own tax returns, in our own little ways, people do their things.
Yeah.
What helps people really see that in themselves? Because that can be difficult, and it can be very confronting to really own that we have those different parts of us. What helps someone have the courage or have the awareness to really see that?
I think it begins when we're really small. I think that we need, as young people, to learn how to delay gratification, how to feel what it's like to really want something, and open up to the feeling of wanting, to be able to say, oh, this is what wanting feels like, and then not to go after it. Because
and not to deny the wanting either, right?
Yeah, when you really want something, it usually only lasts about 5 minutes. And so, when we're young.
I understand.
And so to feel wanting, and then to have adults that are in our midst to model the same thing.
Yes.
So that when we do maybe go buy something, we're doing it not from the space of craving. And so I think that we need to look more closely at our education system and explore how we can help kids learn how to delay gratification through embodied practices. And I think that would be a good start, because I know in my own life, watching how much energy is consumed by just working with constant wanting, that's not even coming from inside me. It seems to just happen when I walk by too many stores or spend too much time online, And I think we also know as adults, or not know, but we feel as adults, that something about technology has changed us.
Yes.
And that the more distracted we are, the harder it is to work with wanting and craving. And so this is something we're going to have to look at as we age, and as our kids grow up in a technological age where our brains have changed, and we can feel them changing. And I think that when you have a lot of distraction, and you combine that with low self-esteem, you have a recipe for corporations to sell you stuff. So that's why mindfulness and giving our attention to what's happening in the present is a political tool. Because when you're mindful, you suspend craving and you don't buy so much.
Michael, there's so much more I'd love to get into with you, but for now, that has to be it. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
If people want to find out more about your work and your schedule, we'll put it up on screen, but Michael Stone Teaching, I think, is the website.
I have a website, which is michaelstoneteaching.com, and it has my schedule and free podcasts and videos and probably more than you should be investigating.
Great. Well, look, Michael, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Great. And thank you for watching, and we look forward to talking with you again on Conscious 2, hopefully very soon. Bye-bye.